to Mind Deconstructed, Mental Health and Wellness with Dr. Kaz and George.
The statements of Dr. Kaz and George are not a substitute for medical care, and our opinions are our own. If you are experiencing a mental health emergency, please seek assistance from a professional in your area.
You can contact us via Twitter at Mind Deconstruct. I'm your host, George. With me is Dr. Kaz. Dr. Kaz Nelson is an American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology certified psychiatrist, licensed to practice medicine in the state of Minnesota, and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota Medical School. On today's episode, Kids with Big Feelings. We're on episode 13 of the Mind Deconstructed. We have a new website, theminddeconstructed.org. Dr. Kaz put that together for us. Thank you, Dr. Kaz.
You're welcome.
And that website was launched just in time for our big article in MinnPost that we had this week. A nice little piece by Andy Steiner. So that was great. Thanks to everyone who read the article and may now be listening out there.
Yeah, we're delighted to welcome any new listeners. And the bottom line is we really hope this podcast helps people to understand a little bit more about themselves, a little more about others, and so we can live in a more compassionate and understanding world when it comes to mental health and well-being.
Yeah, so we got some good questions, some new listeners. Thank you. Feel free to refer your friends to our website, theminddeconstructed.org, or to anywhere you get your podcasts, such as iTunes or Stitcher, or everywhere, I guess, at this point. We're pretty prolific.
We've even got a new YouTube channel you could subscribe to if that's your jam.
I think we've got like 6 views on most of those videos because they're not videos, they're podcasts, which we enjoy, but...
Well, we're going to look for some help in captioning these videos because this is one of the ways we can make the podcast more accessible for people who may be deaf and hard of hearing.
Also, maybe sometime soon we'll do some sort of Facebook Live event where we maybe record a podcast live on Facebook with some actual video. That might be fun, huh?
Fun and or terrifying, but we'll see.
So for Hot Topics in Mental Health today, Kevin Love.
Former Timberwolves player.
But is he a Timberwolf? So he penned an essay, Everyone is Going Through Something. That came out very recently, but he was talking about a game on January 20th. He left the game. He didn't go to practice the next day. There were some very upset teammates, or there's some tension in the locker room based on that. And, you know, his article seemed to be about how he's supposed to act tough and not show his feelings. His article really brought home the point, everyone is going through things.
Yeah, I love this quote that was picked up in the newspaper. He said, growing up, you figure out really quickly how a boy is supposed to act. You learn what it takes to be a man. It's like a playbook. Be strong. Don't talk about your feelings. Get through it on your own. So for 29 years of my life, I followed that playbook.
So we're talking about big feelings today, which is kind of what Kevin Love was talking about. He's got some big feelings in there. For today, we're going to talk about kids with big feelings. Kevin Love is an adult, but kids are some of the people out there who have the biggest feelings. Why are we focusing on kids today?
Yeah, one of the things I love about the quote that Kevin shared and the reflection he made is that he really reflected on those developing years and the lessons that he learned early in life. And so some of the things that we experience, the lessons that we learn early on, can impact us on through adulthood. And I certainly work with a lot of people in my work as a psychiatrist who have difficulties and challenges managing big feelings even as an adult. But they would say that it started in childhood, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about today.
So what's an example of a kid with big feelings?
I have an example I want to share with you to maybe help us relate to how this might feel as a child. George, I don't want to assume anything, but have you ever had that experience where you maybe got up in the middle of the night and you're heading back onto the bed and you step wrong or head the wrong direction and you really just hit your shin, for example, like on the edge of the bed frame or the edge of the table frame, and it hurts like heck?
The edge of my bed frame catches me right in the middle thigh.
Oh, God.
And it will leave a bruise.
Okay. Well, okay. So you know that feeling where it's like a electrical bolt head to toe. You know, it might even bring you to your knees. You lose your breath. It's so incredibly painful. You hobble to the bed, maybe fall asleep. You wake up in the morning. You get out of bed. It's still tender. And have you ever had it, though, where you look down and you say, oh, man, that's going to leave a nasty bruise. That's one of the worst injuries I've ever had. And you look down and nothing.
Yeah, that happens.
What do you think when that happens?
I don't know.
Well, Many people who I've talked about this with, you have this feeling of invalidation. Like, this is so painful. I feel it on the inside. I know this was a terrible injury. And even though no one wants to have a bruise, it's a little bit annoying to have that bruise not show up in sort of demonstrable evidence of the injury that happened.
That's more apt, like if I hit my head on something in
Sure.
my face and
Yes.
I think, oh, that's going to leave a black eye.
Yeah.
And then
Nothing.
You look and there's nothing. And it's like, really? How hard do I have to get hit to get a black eye around here?
That's the example I use because I think all of us can relate to an example like that. Of course, no one wants a cut or nobody wants a bruise, but there's something that's kind of satisfying and edifying when the things that we see or the things that are reflected back to us match our inner experience. And that process is something called validation. And it's something that's critically important for children and adolescents, and adults too, but particularly children and adolescents as they're learning about the world, or for people who have big feelings. Because what happens in children and adolescents with big feelings is they go through life and they have these interactions with people or different things happen, these inner experiences of very strong emotions, but what they get back are messages that are very confusing because somebody might say, oh, stop it, or this isn't a real problem, or don't cry over spilt milk, or just because you got the wrong colored plate, that's no reason to cry, knock it off. That's one I've even said in my own house. So sometimes this is the right approach and works, but for children with big feelings, this is a bit of a mismatch. It can be kind of an oversimplification of problem solving.
So invalidation, if that's the inverse of the validation, is that kind of the tough love or walk it off or you're not really hurt?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to necessarily even be unkind sounding. Somebody overhearing it might say, oh, that's a perfectly kind interaction. A child might say, oh, that hurt. And a parent or a loved one might say, oh, that's not that bad. You'll be just fine. And while that might be true, if that is a mismatch to what the child is worried about or to what the child is experiencing, it doesn't allow for them to make sense of this. And that confusion can be kind of disrupting to their development.
You mentioned children with big feelings. How do I identify a child with big feelings? Or is it all children that it's important, or what are we looking for?
That's a great question because, of course, all kids tantrum. Of course, all kids are irrational. All kids have those tired times during the day where they're not making as much sense as they usually do. But there are some children that are biologically programmed through their genes or their development or maybe even the time where they were in the womb, where they are simply more sensitive in their emotional nervous system than other children. And I mean, those of us who have multiple children, you know, there are the ones that would sleep through any kind of noise and you could have a party going on and they'd be in the corner asleep. And then you have the other children that just the smallest pin drop and they're awake and screaming because they just have this highly tuned, sensitive nervous system.
Is there anything wrong with those kids, or are they just different?
They're probably on a spectrum of different sensitivities to emotions. So you have children that are less sensitive and children that are more sensitive. Nothing inherently wrong with that.
So you're just referring to the broad spectrum of emotional reactions that certain people have to certain stimuli.
Right.
Okay.
But there are children that are very high on that scale. Babies with colic who scream and you wonder, what is going on? Is the milk the right temperature? Did I change the diaper? It's possible the child has that emotional sensitivity that they're born with, and they may need a larger amount of validation to help them make sense of the world.
You're not saying it's okay to not use validation techniques or to invalidate children that aren't higher on that spectrum. I'm assuming best practice would be to use validation techniques with all children.
Yeah, validation is healthy for anybody. It's just particularly important for the children that are having trouble making sense of their experiences.
What is the potential downside or outcome if a child is in a situation where they're continually not being validated appropriately?
Mm-hmm. Well, some kids do okay anyways, and they have a high amount of resiliency. But other kids go on to develop more problematic mental health symptoms like anxiety disorders or post-traumatic stress disorders, or in one of the episodes we talked about a condition called borderline personality disorder. And all of these types of conditions have theories underlying how they maybe came to develop that are related to the interaction between one's biology and the environment and the extent to which those things can align or are misaligned.
So we know that validation is a good thing, right?
It's a healthy way to help people make sense of their world, yes.
And we could also validate adults and others around us when they're having emotional reactions to events. So we know that validation is a good thing, but how do we practice validation?
Yes. What validation is not is just agreeing or acquiescing or going along with what the person wants or saying, there, you'll be fine. That's not validation.
I'm assuming I'm not having a lot of my interactions correct when I just pat my child on the head and say, there.
That may or may not be validating depending on the circumstance, but
I do a little better than that, actually. But, moving on.
I just wanted to be clear, because a lot of people understand that word in different ways. The child that is upset because they got the wrong colored plate. I wanted the green plate and you gave me the red plate. I'm so angry. When I say validation, I'm not suggesting you switch out the plate and give them the plate just because they're upset about it.
Can't just become a pushover because we know that leads to other issues.
Yep. Limits and guidelines and boundaries are important as well. What validation would suggest is instead of saying crying over plates is wrong and you shouldn't feel bad about being given this plate, it would say to acknowledge the feeling first and help them make sense of it. You feel very sad about getting the red plate and, not but and you have the red plate for today.
Is that going to work?
It's subtle, but it works a heck of a lot better down the line rather than saying, knock it off. I'm not going to listen to you cry about this crap.
Yeah, I mean, that does sound better than that. So, you're sad. You're very sad because you got the red plate. And today you're going to have the red plate. And I noticed you didn't like the word but.
Right.
Why is that a problem?
So anytime you say the word but, it erases what you said in front of it. So if anyone's ever said to you, I love you, but you need to do the dishes more, or something like that, it just doesn't feel good.
It may not literally mean that they don't love you.
But that's how you hear it in that moment.
Okay. Yeah.
So in any of these interactions with children or adolescents, the things you want to take out of your vocabulary are things like but, or saying, I understand, because you probably don't understand what it's like to be in their shoes at that moment.
So why is it okay to say you're feeling very sad? So I'm naming their feeling for them.
Yep.
I can't say that I understand.
For someone experiencing a strong emotion, if somebody says to you, I understand, the brain's immediate reaction is to say, no, you don't. You can't possibly understand. So it doesn't advance the argument. But what you can do is use your senses a little bit. You can say, I see that you're upset. I hear that you want this. And so when you talk more about what your senses are telling you, then it's harder for the person to kind of latch onto that and become defensive about it for adults or children.
So what about those kids that are kind of testing the boundaries of, they're throwing those big tantrums based on nothing? Are those legitimate feelings that they're having, and are the same techniques going to work?
When your judgment says this is based on nothing, it's good to notice that that's a judgment because you can't really know what the other person's experiencing. I mean, naturally, we kind of try to put ourselves in their shoes and say, well, that's really not anything to be upset about. But it's the same way if somebody were to get a paper cut and say, oh, man, this is excruciating. And you're saying, oh, well, I've had paper cuts before and that doesn't really hurt that bad, so that person must be completely over reporting this. You can't really judge that because maybe that person has sensitive finger nerves, or maybe that person cut the nerve just right where it really is sending an excruciating pain signal to the brain. As a species, we're not actually really good at judging the pain or the emotional experience of another person based on our own experience because there's so much diversity in what everyone has experienced. So I would suggest setting judgments aside and just focusing on that person's experience and reflecting it right back to them. That will allow them to calm down and engage in problem solving. And half the time, they'll solve the problem themselves. They don't need you to solve the problem, but what they're looking for is that validation.
So we still place limits, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But the validation is going to help them developmentally with what specifically?
Understanding the nature of their feelings, which will give them tools on managing it. So in Kevin Love's quote, he's talking about how he just felt like he needed to be tough and stuff those feelings down. Yeah. So the idea is not to stuff it down, but to acknowledge it and understand it where you can manage it skillfully. And that's the roadmap for skillful emotional management as an adult.
This is kind of the first episode we've done that's focused on children more, but obviously that ties into adulthood. You kind of mentioned that missing this developmental milestone may lead to future issues. Kevin Love suffering from some anxiety, maybe some post-traumatic stress. Is it still going to be about managing those feelings when you get older? Is validation going to help?
Yeah.
At that point still?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And people have differences in their IQ versus their EQ or their emotional intelligence. You might have a young adult who's going off to college and they're the top of their class and the brightest person, they get the highest test scores, but they may not have a lot of self-management of their emotion. And so they get that first B plus and feel practically suicidal because they haven't built up the emotional skills to acknowledge that this was a disappointment and what do you do with disappointment? And so that's where these skills come in very important. And we can play a role in the lives of developing children and helping them understand and manage those feelings so that they're prepared to do that for future challenges.
That sounds good. I kind of like that this episode focused on children and then tied it into the, how that impacts adults and children as they turn into adults.
And just as a disclosure, I'm an adult psychiatrist and not a child and adolescent psychiatrist, but I work with many adults who can comment on those childhood years and put together some of those pieces. And all psychiatrists are hopefully looking at people in a developmental picture.
Yeah, because everyone developed.
Yep, they had their own journey through life with their own particular challenges and stresses.
So how else can we apply the yes and approach with our kids or any child?
Well, I gave the example of the plates talking about little kids, but we could talk about a teenager. And I'll just pick a silly example where somebody could say, well, this couldn't possibly apply, right? And so what if you had a teenage daughter and she said to you, I know I'm only 14, but I'm running away with Billy and I'm going to go marry him because I love him so much.
That's probably a scary example, not a silly example.
Good point. Good point. Yes, that's many parents' idea of a nightmare. And you'd say, well, how could you use the yes and approach for that? But even an example like this, you could say, yes, you love Billy. You want to spend the rest of your life with Billy. And that's not an option right now, and I forbid it. But you see how you
Subtle.
you could have easily said, no, absolutely not over my dead body. And you don't have a conversation at that point. But if you lead in by acknowledging the person's intent and their feelings, that's a lead into problem solving or setting a limit, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I really wanted to use the but with that example and just wipe out that first part.
Right. Because of the judgments involved, particularly in that scenario, your brain is screaming but. So I'm giving you encouragement to try the yes and approach and see if that can make a difference. And hopefully that'll get you a little bit of a toehold in there to have a conversation rather than it feeling like a fight.
I think I can hopefully apply this yes and approach in not just with children, but in more aspects of my life, be better at validating those around me when they come to me with concerns.
It's free and it works, and there's really not a downside. The problem is it's hard to do, particularly when a situation is screaming at you that this is completely not legitimate or not fair, or you're accusing me of this and I didn't do that, right?
Yeah, we have our own emotions to deal with. I can't spend my energy validating you if I'm dealing with my own emotions in that particular moment.
That's the challenge, is to notice one's own emotions, set them aside for a moment to be able to validate the other person. And if you're able to do that, the outcome is going to be much, much better.
We'll give it a shot.
All right, report back.
Thank you for joining us today. This podcast was produced by Kaz and George. Music by Paul.
He's the best.
Contact us and send us your questions on Twitter at Mind Deconstruct.